Ethan Crawford sat quietly in a corner booth of his own restaurant, stomach empty, heart heavy, and unnoticed by the people he had trusted for years. His staff glanced his way, their expressions indifferent, even judgmental, their attention drifting quickly back to the better-dressed guests who filled the sleek dining room of Crawford Va Company, a renowned fine dining establishment that had once been the jewel of his career. None of them recognized him. None of them cared. Except for her, the only person who showed him a shred of kindness that evening. A young waitress who smiled warmly and treated him like a person, not knowing she was serving the CEO of the entire restaurant group. Ethan Crawford had spent over 30 years building his empire. It all started as a small family-owned eatery in Portland, Oregon. His mother had run the kitchen. His father had greeted guests at the door. Back then, the food was simple but hearty, and the smiles were always genuine. From those humble beginnings grew Crawford Va Company, a chain of high-end restaurants scattered across the country, known for impeccable cuisine, luxurious decor, and an air of exclusivity that attracted business moguls, celebrities, and old-money families alike. But something had begun to fester beneath the glossy surface. Ethan had started noticing complaints, at first small, easily dismissed. An email here, a comment on social media there. Then the volume increased. Letters arrived, not just from dissatisfied customers, but from people who described experiences that deeply disturbed him. They spoke of being treated with cold indifference, if not outright disdain, by his staff. There were murmurs that guests who didn't look wealthy were ignored, seated in corners, or made to wait while others were greeted like royalty. People whispered that the restaurants had stopped caring about hospitality unless it came with a hefty tip. This wasn't what Ethan had built. His empire was supposed to stand for quality, not just in food, but in how people were treated. He had promised himself that no matter how big Crawford Va Company became, they would never lose sight of what mattered most, making every guest feel welcome. One late evening, sitting alone in his penthouse in Seattle, he read yet another message that shook him. I walked into Crawford Va Company last night, just hoping for a good meal after a brutal day. I wasn't dressed fancy, didn't think I had to be, but I had cash to spend. Nobody greeted me. I stood there for 20 minutes before anyone even looked at me, and when they did, it was like I didn't belong. I left humiliated. Do better. Ethan set his phone down on the marble kitchen counter and sighed. He had worked too hard for this. This wasn't just bad press. It was a betrayal of everything he stood for. He decided then and there he needed to see it with his own eyes. The next morning, Ethan dug through his closet, ignoring the custom suits and silk ties he usually wore. Instead, he pulled out a faded green flannel shirt that smelled faintly of mothballs and a pair of old jeans with fraying hems. He slipped on scuffed work boots he hadn't worn in years. He let his beard grow in rough and uneven over the past week and pulled a mariner's cap low over his forehead. When he glanced in the mirror, he no longer saw Ethan Crawford, CEO and multimillionaire. He saw a tired, middle-aged man who looked like he'd had more bad luck than good. But the clothes weren't enough. He emptied his wallet, leaving behind the platinum credit cards and cash, and tucked a few crumpled dollar bills into his pocket. If he was going to do this, he needed to feel it. He left his Tesla in the garage and took the city bus across town. The trip was humbling. He felt the judgmental glances, the silent sighs of strangers assuming he had nowhere better to be. By the time he stepped off at the entrance to Crawford Va Company, the sun was setting behind the glass and steel skyline. The restaurant shimmered under golden lights, a beacon of wealth and prestige. This was it. He took a deep breath, adjusted his cap, and walked through the doors of his own restaurant. As a nobody, what happened next wasn't entirely unexpected. The moment Ethan entered, he felt it. The atmosphere was rich with quiet power. Waiters glided through the dining room, expertly balancing trays laden with seared scallops and truffle risotto. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over sleek leather banquettes and polished marble floors. The faint clinking of wine glasses punctuated the soft murmur of high-stakes business deals and whispered gossip. But beneath it all was something colder, an invisible wall that divided those who belonged and those who didn't. Ethan lingered near the entrance, watching. A sharply dressed couple was immediately greeted by a hostess, who smiled broadly and offered them their choice of seating. Another man in a bespoke navy suit was shown to his table without needing to ask. His chair was pulled out before he even sat. When Ethan stepped forward, however, the reception was very different. The hostess, a young blonde named Madison, barely looked up from her reservation book. Her eyes flicked from his cap to his worn boots. Her lips thinned. "Can I help you?" she asked flatly, already sounding tired of him. Ethan nodded, just hoping to get something to eat. Madison sighed, tapping at the screen with a crimson-painted nail. "Do you have a reservation?" He could have laughed. He knew the book was full, but he also knew they always kept tables open for VIPs. He shook his head. "No, Sebastian. Just hoping you have room." "It's going to be at least an hour," she said without looking up again. Ethan glanced around. He could see 3 empty tables. His empty stomach growled softly. Before he could say anything, another voice joined the conversation. "I'll handle it," said a man stepping up behind Madison. Ethan turned to find a broad-shouldered man in an immaculately pressed shirt, his name tag reading manager, Lucas Grant. Lucas gave Ethan a once-over and forced a tight, polite smile. "We're at capacity tonight," Lucas said, his tone clipped. "Might I recommend one of the diners down the street?" Ethan stood his ground. "I don't mind waiting." Lucas's jaw tightened. "Sir, Khadafat Vakal offers a certain experience. Our guests expect a particular atmosphere." His meaning was clear: you don't fit in here. Ethan took a slow breath and nodded. He wasn't here to fight. He was here to see. Before Lucas could dismiss him again, another voice cut in. "I can take him." Both men turned. A young woman with dark curls pulled back in a ponytail stood a few feet away, holding an armful of plates. Her name Reed Maya. Her smile was genuine, if a little tired. "There's an open table by the window," she said. "I'll take care of him." Lucas frowned. "Maya." She didn't wait for him to finish. "It's open," she said firmly, already moving to grab a menu. Ethan followed her through the dining room, feeling the weight of stairs on his back. As he sat, he realized he hadn't felt this small in years. But Maya's kindness broke through that feeling. Maya handed him a menu, her expression warm. "Can I get you something to drink?" "Just water," Ethan said. "If that's all right." "Of course." She returned moments later with a glass of water and a small bread basket. "Take your time," she said. Ethan watched her move through the dining room. Unlike the other servers, who laughed with wealthy guests and ignored others, Maya greeted everyone with the same quiet respect. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't rolling her eyes. She simply worked. When she returned, she leaned in and whispered, "If you're not sure what to order, I can bring you something small." "On me." Ethan felt his throat tighten. He was a man who could buy the entire building outright, but in that moment, he let himself imagine that this meal might cost him his last dollar. "You don't have to," he said. "I know," she replied, "but I want to." A few minutes later, she brought a bowl of soup and a warm roll, plated as beautifully as any entree. Ethan ate slowly. It wasn't the food. It was what it meant. But then things changed. Lucas was watching. Madison was whispering to another waiter, a slick young man named Trevor, who approached Ethan's table with a forced smile. "I'm going to need payment up front," Trevor said quietly. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Up front?" "Certain guests," Trevor said. "We ask for payment before service." Maya returned just in time to hear this. Her eyes flashed. "That's not our policy," she said. "It's what Lucas said," Trevor replied weakly. Maya glanced toward Lucas, who stood silently across the room, watching. Ethan put down his spoon. "Do you ask him to pay up front?" he asked, gesturing toward a man in an Armani suit at a nearby table. Trevor had no answer. Lucas gave him a tiny shake of the head, and Trevor slunk away. Maya sighed. "I'm sorry. That shouldn't have happened." "How long have you worked here?" Ethan asked. 2 years, she said softly. "Do you like it?" "I like the customers," she replied. That told him everything. Moments later, Lucas approached. "Maya." "A word," he said curtly. She looked back at Ethan. "I'll be right back." Ethan sat in silence as she followed Lucas toward the back. He imagined the conversation happening behind the kitchen door. He knew Lucas was scolding her, maybe threatening her job. He clenched his jaw. This wasn't a one-time problem. This was systemic, a culture issue, something that had poisoned his restaurant while he wasn't looking. But he had the power to fix it, and tomorrow he would. Penet evening, Kthafot Vakal. Opened as usual. The staff prepped tables and polished glasses, laughing as they did every day. Until 6 p.m. That's when Ethan walked through the front doors in a charcoal suit, his shoes shining, his presence commanding. Madison's face paled. "Good evening, sir," she stammered. Ethan said nothing. His eyes searched until they found Maya. She saw him and froze. Whispers rippled through the room. Trevor's face drained of color. Lucas emerged from the office, his smile strained. "Mr. Crawford," Lucas said quickly. "We weren't expecting. Do I need special treatment?" Ethan asked quietly. "No, sir," Lucas replied, stiff. Ethan addressed the room. "How many of you knew who I was last night?" Silence. "I came here because I'd heard things," Ethan said. "And what I found disgusted me." He turned to Lucas. "You're fired." Lucas gaped. "Sir, I don't reward people who push customers away," Ethan said. "Leadership requires character." He turned to Maya. "You, on the other hand." He handed her a card. She stared. "General Manager," it read. "Effective immediately." Maya's breath caught. I've never managed before. "You know how people should be treated," Ethan said. "That's enough." She nodded slowly. "Yes." Ethan turned to the staff. "Things changed tonight," he said. "Every customer matters. Some would stay. Some would leave. Vodkafot Vakal would never be the same, and neither would Ethan. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness changes everything." Maya didn't know who he was. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was just kind, and that made all the difference.